switch over from whatever they were doing in their last hour. New Zealand time is it 12 noon?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Right, good. We've got the rain is absolutely hammering down here in Melbourne, and it's 10 a.m. local time. So we'll just give people another minute or so, and then we will kick off. So welcome those of you who are in the room, now 42. This is an exciting piece of research, and we're really looking forward to sharing it with you. So, uh, Natalie, do you want to actually share the slide deck? We'll just get the opening slide up ready for people, and I'll
Sure.
kick off. I'll kick off at 3 minutes past, just giving I can see lots of people coming in the front door right now. They're at the right place at the right time. And if you're here, you are here because you're interested in multi-generational housing in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so it's good to have you joining us this morning to talk about this. It's a collaboration between the Urban Advisory and Community Housing Aotearoa and BRANZ and Matakohe. And it's 10:03, so off we go. Look,
Can you see my screen clearly? It's just checking that it's all
yep,
working.
yep,
Okay.
perfect. The slideshow is working perfectly. Thank you. All good. So, no mai haere mai tēnā koutou katoa. It's an absolute delight on behalf of Community Housing Aotearoa to
Oh,
host this hui. And to be hearing about this amazing piece of research, which we support deeply from Community Housing Aotearoa's perspective. Research matters. It's hugely important, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's important. As we go through. But you may be aware of recent announcements from the government around the Flexi Fund, and we see significant opportunities for ongoing research and delivery. And enormous demand for multi-generational living. And so I just thought we'd start with a little bit of broad context, a warm welcome to you all, and then we'll get into the research. And we're hoping to leave plenty of time for Q&A near the end. We also have Ian Fistonich from Penina Trust on the call, who was a participant in the research. So it's a nice mix of people who were involved, who have participated in the project. And if you've got any questions for him or anyone, please get those ready for the end. Part of the dialogue around the Flexi Fund. I had the privilege yesterday of having an hour of Q&A with Chris Bishop as the minister. It's really clear that he sees value in understanding unmet need, and then matching the best deliveries to that is possible, and that particularly applies for multi-generational housing. I think for many years this was seen as a sideshow, and I think what I'd like to do is challenge that and compel you to think of this as a mainstream part of the solutions for our communities and for our whānau across Aotearoa now and into the future. And I think the Flexi Fund will potentially, once there's more funding put into it, allow for far broader range of initiatives and allow you all as providers to build on the projects and the successful multi-generational housing outcomes that you're already delivering. And I wanted to make it real by showing you a photo of my son. That's him there laying a pathway between his tiny home, which is in my back garden. My wife and I noticed he was struggling to make rent, and he was unemployed for more than a year hunting for jobs. And so we put a tiny home in the back garden, and we're now a multi-generational household again, having lived apart for 3 years. And so just wanted to bring it home and make it real. And that's our back garden, and we love having him living with us. And mum's also got an invitation when she needs some extra support. She'll probably come live with us too. So I'm going to hand over at this point to the team, to Natalie, and welcome. Great to have you join us, and hope this is stimulating and inspiring as we seek to grow multi-generational housing in Aotearoa. Natalie, over to you.
Kia ora, thanks Paul, and we'll welcome everyone. Ko Natalie Allen tōku ingoa. I'm based in Tamaki Makaurau, and I also have the fantastic Jade Kake joining me on the call, and we're going to kind of jump between the two of us to share some of these research findings. I'll start by giving you a little bit of an overview quite quickly, just so that you know the background of why and how we did this piece of work, and then we're going to jump right into sharing the barriers and also some of the key levers we think could be pulled in order to start shifting things and supporting this important area of housing more in Aotearoa. So we started with a research question: what are the key barriers being faced to the delivery of multi-generational housing in New Zealand? And we're very grateful to BRANZ for their funding of this project. We had a fantastic research team with Dr. Kate Bryson, Jackie Paul, Jade Kake, Greer O'Donnell, and Dr. Charmaine Ilaiū Talei as well. In terms of project deliverables, there's a research report which you can access, and we'll have links at the end of the presentation. We've also done a policy paper to kind of focus in on those policy recommendations as a result of the research, a webinar which we'll make available online afterwards as well if anyone would like to share it, and we've started publishing some articles and journal papers to get the message out there as well. So let's kind of start with the big question: what is multi-generational housing? There's obviously a number of definitions, and really looking at things, we felt like broad was actually most appropriate in terms of being households where more than one generation of related adults live together. That can include a whole lot of different combinations, and much like Paul, I myself have found myself now living in a multi-generational way with my parents, which, having young children, is an absolutely wonderful outcome, I have to say. And there's also, some really fantastic projects that we're starting to see come online, and it'll be great to hear from Ian later in the presentation. This is one of Penina Trust's latest projects. So the research went through a number of different phases. We started with, literature and policy view, just to set the scene and establish what was known and not known, and Jade will cover that shortly. Then we focused on interviews because we really wanted rich data. We had anecdotal evidence that there were a range of barriers, and we were conscious that really addressing these likely required quite a systems response. And so it was important to deep dive with 10 councils around the country, 10 residents who are currently living in varied forms of multi-generational housing, and then 15 interviewers with a really broad spectrum of developers, including some fantastic CHAR members, to unpack all the different aspects of what was working and was not working. We then, of course, did quite extensive data coding and thematic analysis across the team, looking at it from different lenses in order for us to pull together the key findings. So I'll pass over to Jade in terms of a quick summary of what we already know and some gap analysis.
Ka pai, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Jade Kake tōku ingoa. So I think that there's a good summary on the page here, but I guess what we found is that there isn't a great deal of multi-generational housing research that's been conducted in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The 2015 BRANZ report, and I don't know, oh my God, Leisner and I don't know how to say the second name, which is embarrassing because I've written it so many times, Dupuis or something like that. The 2015 report has been absolutely foundational, but nothing much had been done since then. And so 10 years on, a lot has changed, and also our scope was slightly different to that report, so we're able to kind of build on and contribute and extend on that. There is a bit of multi-generational housing research in other kind of equivalent contexts, particularly Australia, and which has probably the most similar policy settings to ours and a similar kind of history of settler colonialism. There's also a bit of older research, which is more centered on Asian and Eastern European context, where this is there's been a continuous tradition and it's reasonably well researched. But again, that's quite different to our context, and so it can be difficult to transfer some of those learnings and understand what is relevant here. There's also some issues around data collection, so we don't have a consistent picture of who is living multi-generationally, mostly because of the lack of definitions and how it's described and collected within our statistics. And there is a kind of strong relationship between multi-generational housing and overcrowding. But I think one of the key things for us was how overcrowding is defined, considered, and what that means for demographics that are more likely to live in multi-generational housing. And so I guess we were trying to critically interrogate what was written about that and think about it more, from a strengths base, and ensuring that we're kind of understanding that cultural lens as opposed to seeing multi-generational equals overcrowding, which I think is a simplistic narrative that we can see come through in policy or, from policymakers from time to time. And that definition issue came up a lot. One of the other gaps we found is that there isn't much around the social dynamics, and particularly when there's different degrees of equity or ownership and what that might mean for power dynamics and how those are navigated within the household structure. And I think I'll leave it there. Lots of interesting things to say, but I'll hand it back to you, Natalie.
Kia ora. So I just wanted to flag also that for a couple of years now, we've been developing the New Zealand Housing Survey at the Urban Advisory because we're very conscious of these gaps in a lot of data. And so we've recently released our first report, and we've got another 2,500 responses to add to the 2,500 we had coming online in the new year, which is great. We're also starting to test it in localized areas. And what was super interesting recently when running the survey in Avondale, which is a suburb in Auckland, where we found that, of those respondents aged 40 to 60, there were 400 responses from that suburb. 24% had adult children living at home. 10% of them had, lived with a parent as well. And of those households, 2 out of 3 were still providing financial support to at least one of those adults. There's so much more data we could dig into there, but I really wanted to highlight just how important it is to consider all these different arrangements when we're thinking about how to actually provide the right houses in the right places for New Zealanders. Because, particularly with the cost of living, there's all kinds of additional pressures on, the already very wonderful reasons about, familial support, etc., that can also be experienced through multi-generational living. And I think it's a combination of all these factors which is really driving up demand. And we're looking forward to tracking this a lot more closely in the survey going forward. So in terms of an overview of our findings from this piece of research, Jade's already raised, the definitional challenges which came out from the very early days of the literature review, but also through all those interviews. It was, very much across all the different types of interviews that we did with different groups. It came up as impacting in various ways. Variable planning rules and how they change across the country made it quite difficult. Obviously, that's particularly interesting in the announcements that we've had in the last kind of 48 hours around changes that are coming online. There were a number of funding and financing barriers, and we'll speak to how some of those can be addressed later on in the presentation. Infrastructure requirements and how development contributions were considered were also raised, not only by developers, but also by a number of the councils interviewed, and even by, residents who were trying to grapple with how best to provide their current home, and some of which who wanted to move as well to kind of expand their multi-generational living experience. Consenting processes came up a lot as well in line with those kind of planning rules. There were specific papakainga challenges which we included in the research, and Jade and Jackie did a fantastic job of, particularly looking at some of these. And then also working with Charmaine, we really deep dived into some of the lack of options for our Pacific whānau. So just over to Jade to give us a bit of a summary of the Tau Māori and Pacific insights on the next couple of slides before I deep dive into more of the barriers.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess one of the key things we found is that although multi-generational housing is a common and desired kind of housing configuration for Māori whānau, it wasn't considered to be the same thing as papakainga. And so those definitions are necessarily separate but related concepts. And I think one of the really interesting things we found is that for some whānau, their multi-generational living could span separate dwellings that aren't actually physically on the same site or even on connected sites. And so conceptually, that really pushed our definition out, and I'm still kind of grappling with that because I think that's a really interesting concept. If you're living between multiple dwellings as a whānau, is that multi-generational living, and does it matter that those houses aren't on the same papakainga or on the same piece of whenua? There was a lot of values alignment. So if I think for a lot of Māori, multi-generational, that term means something in English, but I think it was just seen as a really normal thing and that aligned really well with cultural values. That said, a lot of the barriers are kind of the same if it's on general title land, but if we're looking at multi-generational housing on whenua Māori, and this has been documented a lot, there's a lot of persistent barriers, and some of those have been addressed over time. But if anyone's familiar with the 2011 and 2014 Office of the Auditor General's reports around housing on Māori land, you'll find that a lot of the barriers are still in place. So, a lot of those barriers were still consistent and were still a persistent problem. And I suppose the last thing I wanted to say on this slide is that, and I'm going to quote Roy Hoskins here, and it's not part of this research, but something he often says is that we're colonized by the environments that we're forced to live in. And I think it's worth noting that for whānau Māori, there's very limited housing choice because we have very limited access to home ownership relative to the wider population. And so whānau live multi-generationally, and often the home configuration and the whānau fit isn't right. But that isn't the fault of the whānau for wanting to live together. It's the fact that we don't have suitable housing available to them in a way that whānau can access. And so I guess I just wanted to make that point because I think that's really key for our whānau Māori living multi-generationally and often in housing that is not fit for purpose and is not ideal, but they're making it work.
Kia ora, Jade.
I'm still talking, yeah. Charmaine led this piece of the research. I guess some of the things I wanted to touch on is that there are some similarities with barriers and considerations for Māori. Very strong cultural considerations underpinning this form of living, particularly around collective care and for elderly. And it's really important in terms of sharing cultural traditions, language, maintaining culture, but also just that familial responsibility. And that came through really strongly with all of the respondents. I did touch on it before, but just that issue around the narrative of overcrowding and how that is applied to Pacific families living multi-generationally. And again, just really emphasizing that it's not the whānau that are the problem, it's our housing stock that's the problem. And trying to shift that narrative, I think, would fit under our social cultural barriers. And yeah, I think, again, Pacific peoples have low home ownership rates, and there's generally not housing that has been designed to be fit for purpose for these housings, or a very limited stock at an inaccessible price point. And so when you're renting, it can be really difficult to find housing that's suitable. And the last thing I wanted to mention was that there were some differences with Māori, which I thought were interesting. So we had some discussion from both groups around tangihanga in the home. And I think for Pacific peoples, or for some of the respondents, a large living space, a large open living space that was connected to the kitchen was seen as helpful, whereas for Māori respondents, it was, you'd want that separation. And I had assumed those things would be the same. And I don't wish to imply that Pacific peoples are a monolith. That view may change between families and between different Pacific cultures, but it came through at least in one of the interviews, and that was a surprise to me because I had a vision those things might be quite similar.
Great. So it was really important for our team to kind of look at a whole lot of those critical Te Māori and Pacific layers sort of before we came to some of the key themes, so that we were ensured that they were embedded throughout the research. And so, yeah, a big thank you to our team for facilitating those conversations and making sure these important lenses were applied to the way that we were doing the data analysis as well. So in terms of the kind of high-level barriers, ultimately there were 5 key buckets or ways we were able to look at them. And the reason that we did this was really about trying to capture the barriers that we were, being told about through each of the interviews, but also in order for us to kind of interrogate what the levers were to address those barriers. And I think that was kind of the constant process that we went through in the research, was to say, hey, it's fantastic that we're acknowledging what these barriers are. Now, how do we kind of systematically go through and address a lot of these, which is really where the policy paper came from. And I'm sure that there's many more discussions we can have after today about these barriers as we unpick them as well. I'm going to race through these quickly now, but I just wanted to share some quotes while I'm kind of talking. I won't read them, but they're on the screen for you to absorb. So in terms of the socio-historical barriers, obviously we heard a lot about the dominance of the nuclear family model and how that's impacted the current housing stock that's available. And Jade mentioned this before as well. And this was across both Pākehā and sort of Western cultural norms that we heard from as being a barrier too. So it wasn't just a Māori and Pacific issue, it was across the board. We heard that all those currently living multi-generationally, often it was a real struggle to find the right home. They had to go down a design route often to create what they needed. And it made moving particularly tricky, which, given the housing mobility issues we have in New Zealand at the moment, was a really important layer to think about when we're thinking about the barriers. There were significant kind of colonial and urbanisation impacts, which were raised a number of times in terms of the policy legacy that we've got, our migration patterns and how that's impacted our housing stock available as well. And also the fact that traditionally a lot of multi-generational housing was associated with, low-income migrant Māori or Pacific families, and that sort of reinforced perceptions that it wasn't a mainstream housing option in many people's minds. And that was something that a lot of the interviewees, particularly councils, but also developers, I felt like they were constantly on a bit of an education journey when they were getting their various projects through hoops. And a lot of these were kind of reinforced by the theme that there was a mismatch with the housing typologies currently available. In terms of the central government barriers, it was raised a lot that there was poor housing demand data guiding a lot of government procurement. Jade will speak, I'm sure, to the housing register underreporting demand for large multi-generational homes because families were splitting their applications to improve their eligibility, which was really leading to some quite distorted procurement decisions in the eyes of a number of our interviewees. Also, the lack of building code suitability, often for multi-generational housing, particularly compliances with fire safety technical requirements. And again, this is something I'm sure Jade will pick up on when we discuss, how we shift the dial on some of these barriers. It was also raised a lot that there was a lack of clarity across policy. This stemmed from the lack of a consistent definition, but just also the different ways that it was included in different government strategies, from the GPS HUD to the Resource Management Act. And that was also raised by a number of interviewees as a really tricky thing in terms of that lack of clear direction being provided so that it was a point that they could springboard from and respond to the demand that they felt they were experiencing. There were also a number of funding and procurement constraints in terms of the public housing funding mechanisms, like the income rent related subsidy, was seen to sort of favour small dwellings, and it made larger multi-gen homes financially unavailable for a number of our developers who otherwise were interested in considering them. So that's a bit of an overview. Obviously, there's a lot more in the report, and please dive in if you can or you'd like to know more. And also, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A section on Zoom, because we'll talk about them soon. Jumping to the local government barriers, District plan provisions and resource consenting was an area that was raised a lot in terms of there being quite overlapping or complex planning instruments across regional and local levels, which were creating uncertainty and delays. And we heard this both from council participants and developer participants, and also from families who had to navigate these provisions when they were developing their homes. Many plans define dwellings by the number of kitchens, so adding a second kitchen could trigger a classification for 2 dwellings. But this was something that a lot of families were grappling with, and it was impacting a lot of the design decisions that were made in terms of how the rest of the home was designed as well. Development contributions and infrastructure costs were raised because of the high infrastructure cost required for pumps and service connections, which undermined project viability in a number of instances. And because DCs were charged per additional household unit, even when the resources were shared, a number of people raised that it felt as though it was discouraging multi-generational layouts. There's also a lot of building consent requirement issues that were raised in terms of the way that the building code requirements were perceived to be interpreted inconsistently sometimes, particularly around fire safety, again, came up as a concern. And there was also a lot of discussion about rural servicing in terms of wastewater and how that could trigger unnecessary consents. And this was balanced with the fact that because a number of respondents felt like it was hard to find the right home or deliver the right home in an urban setting, sometimes more fringe locations were actually seen as sort of an easier pathway. And so there was this tension between the requirements where people actually wanted to live and where they felt they could actually deliver those homes. There's so much more I could unpack on local government barriers, but I want to jump ahead to kind of industry barriers, which is quite broad. And it was interesting to, speak with 2 developers about this, but also with residents and kind of get this, these different perspectives and bring them together when we were looking at this barrier. The market perception of demand uncertainty was a really interesting one, and it obviously related to those central government barriers a lot. We found that there was this perception that industry was often assuming that there was little demand, whereas there was a whole lot of anecdotal evidence of it growing, particularly coming through from our council interviewees. And so there was this real sense of education being an underlying barrier as part of this kind of industry area. And that was often also tied to a lack of incentives or policy support to kind of experiment with different models in order to, essentially pave the way for more of this product to be delivered and, the feasibility metrics to stack up because of that, increasing of availability.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in and say that the developers felt like they were really shouldering all the risk and that there wasn't adequate recognition from government that actually this is riskier, there's no certainty for them, and also it costs more. And so the subsidies provided may not be enough. And so they're kind of subsidizing multi-generational housing. A lot of them were really wanted to do it, especially the community developers who knew the communities they were working with and knew the need for this, but they didn't have the certainty built into this financial model to be able to confidently make it work. Or they were, but at great kind of cost to the organization.
Awesome, thanks, Jade. Yes, that was definitely a great point that came through. Please keep adding to my summaries. Yeah, and so there was also design challenges and cost implications. And again, Jade and Jackie, from a particularly architectural lens in this project, looked at a lot of those design challenges, Charmaine as well, and the related kind of cost implications. there was a real limited understanding of universal design and sort of the spatial needs of multi-generational houses. And it was also raised quite a bit by councils, this idea that, having some established plans that, had consensus buy-in from a number of councils, so that it was easier to tell, what was a really great project and what wasn't through that process. Sort of the lack of those was essentially seen as a barrier, and so therefore it was a great opportunity for us to think about how that could potentially be delivered through future research.
Yeah, and the design stuff really started right from site selection. So because these homes are necessarily larger and because they're multi-generational, they need to be accessible, which means they necessarily have a larger footprint. And not all sites, particularly steeper or hilly sites, are going to be suitable for this form of housing. And so that was something the developers raised. Also, some of the requirements we heard about were just the need for larger rooms, the need for hard wearing finishes on surfaces that are going to get more wear and tear, wider hallways, and particularly around bathrooms, being able to separate those bathroom functions or having additional toilets or additional showers, that kind of thing, to be able to handle peak loads was really important. And then back on the site, I meant to mention also things like parking, depending on where it's located. How do you accommodate, especially when there's a lot of adults? I think, I shouldn't say I've got whānau who have got, seven cars on the front lawn of the house, and so especially if you're in an area that's not well serviced by public transport or isn't really suitable for more active kind of modes of transport, then you need somewhere for all those cars. And it needs to be planned in from the beginning so you don't get cars all over the boom and on the front yard.
Yes, so true. And in terms of the household barriers as well, again, it was really interesting to look at this from the lenses of the households themselves, but also speaking with developers and councils and sort of triangulating some of these barriers and findings. So, access to land and the right housing product was seen as the biggest barrier, which Jade spoke to as well. And it's really about, families often reported lacking access to suitably sized land parcels that could accommodate, their larger or clustered dwellings. Existing housing stock was seen to be dominated by kind of small nuclear family homes, or comparatively small, I guess, leaving few options for those extended households. And so this idea of customization kind of became a barrier for many households. Access to finance was another really big one in terms of traditional mortgage structures being designed for, single households, not necessarily multiple income earners, or complex ownership arrangements. And, a number of people commented about the too hard basket that they felt they were being sort of told when they did speak to traditional lenders, and also, providers in terms of lawyers, etc. And again, those kind of legal frameworks, like the way equity was considered, and how ownership was defined in terms of a shared ownership arrangement, often it was seen as complex, and people felt like they had to start from scratch, even if they knew other people that had done it. And so there wasn't really a sense of, being able to follow a well-trodden path, which felt like it had been a barrier for a number of families for a long time. And it was a real commitment often to actually get into multi-generational housing. And so, it really came down to the fact that for a lot of people, they could see the tremendous social benefits for their whānau in living that way. And so it was sort of worth the effort, but no one kind of reported a very smooth process in terms of, usually those legal frameworks and access to finance.
Yeah, and the ownership stuff gets really tricky if you're an in-law or if they're blended families, because there isn't that kind of obvious inheritance line of sight that can cover some of those issues. Another issue is also if adult children kind of buy into their parents' mortgages and later want to withdraw from that setup and get their own mortgage, that's really hard because their parents might be of an age where they can't refinance. They're not able to buy them out, and therefore they're not eligible to purchase a home elsewhere. So yeah, lots of tricky, thorny financial problems to solve.
Yeah, and I think that's what made it so exciting to hear the stories of the people who had solved these issues and just the way in which they'd done that and their kind of preparedness to share that information. And I think, we'll speak at the end to some of the future opportunities for research, but that was really one in terms of making a whole lot of these learnings readily available. And in the context of the great work that CHAR does as well, providing resources, etc., is something fantastic to think about because it's definitely a more well-worn path than I think we often realise in New Zealand, again, because of our lack of data in this space. So we wanted to try and put all the findings on one slide for you, and here's our attempt at a findings summary. And I think what's really important to talk about here is obviously we've categorised these barriers in order that we can, discuss them in detail in the report, so that we could interrogate them as a research team to think about what the tools and levers might be to address some of these barriers. But, because housing is very much a systems issue, these barriers do all interrelate with one another. And so it's, as with all things in housing, there's no silver bullet. It's a matter of actually pulling a whole lot of tools and levers, in unison often in order to actually unlock some of these barriers and make it easier for people to live in these, wonderful ways. So I'm going to hand back over to Jade in terms of focusing on some of the recommendations for addressing barriers to multi-gen housing.
Yeah, so if you look at the report, you'll see we have so many recommendations, and so we thought we would just give a quick overview and then focus in on a few specific ones because I think it's easy to get lost in the forest of good ideas. Which was a challenge for ourselves when we were putting together the report because there was a lot of really good information that came out of the interviews and the analysis.
Just a quick, really deep thanks to all the participants because they were so forthcoming with tremendous detail about all their stories, their lived experience, and also just a really strong awareness of all the different aspects that came together. So, we were really fortunate to have a tremendous amount of data in all our interviews to actually work with in this piece of research. Sorry, Jade.
Yeah, and so just a quick kind of bullet point list of some of the kind of policy recommendations. As we've kind of said a few times, it came up in the literature review and in the interviews, but just the lack of clarity around what is multi-generational housing and how does it show up in various places in central and local government policy. And then also national policy direction. I mean, this is something that's happening already. We've seen with the NES for Papakainga. And so there's an opportunity for something similar to occur with multi-generational housing. Although, as Natalie mentioned before, big changes are underway with our planning system and our building code. And these could be really a great positive opportunity, but it's a rapidly moving space. So if we have some ability to influence that, we could see better outcomes for multi-generational housing, but we'll see. Building code, it's quite rigid in terms of how it defines housing and then what triggers a new class in terms of fire safety. And that can be a barrier, and we've got some suggestion around how to address that barrier. Flexible planning framework. So we did hear a lot about how it was a complicated process and difficult to navigate. I think there's been some great efforts in the area of Papakainga by some councils, and I think that there could be some more work done to support whānau to navigate the process of developing multi-generational housing and getting kind of clear and consistent answers and support. And then things like financial incentives for developers. So as we mentioned before, developers feel like they're shouldering all the risk, trying to provide something that's needed, and just needing to maybe have some kind of underwrite or targeted incentives to support that to occur and de-risk that for developers, including community housing providers who are trying to provide appropriate housing for the communities they serve. And IRS also came up as an issue. So, thinking through how those policy settings might change to better support mixed income multi-generational households, because you end up with this tricky situation where some are eligible and some are not. And it makes it difficult to be able to occupy that home together. And then finally reviewing New Zealand superannuation policy so that retirees aren't penalised for living in multi-generational arrangements. Next slide, yeah, great. So when Natalie and I were talking and preparing for this webinar, because there's so many good ideas, I was like, okay, let's just pick, the top couple of ideas that have come through that we think would have the most impact. And so I'll just talk through those quickly. So for MB, we had the definitions. So definitions might show up in a few different places, but for our purposes here, A2 of the building code has a list of definitions, and multi-generational housing is not considered under that. It's not explicitly defined. And also that's an issue for local government, which we raise as well. The fire risk group, so this one's quite an interesting one. So under C4 of the building code, we could look to classify multi-generational housing as SH, and including multiple interconnected units and attached buildings accommodating 6 or more people. So just to unpack that, basically what that means is when you have 6 or more people, it triggers a new fire risk group, which means that you need to have much more stringent kind of fire protection, and a fire engineer gets involved, and it becomes more costly. And of course, we think that fire safety is really important, but it suddenly kind of triggers a whole bunch of new things, a whole bunch of new compliance issues, which means that housing generally kind of stops at 5-bedroom. And I think largely for that reason, not only because there's a smaller number of larger families, but also I think the compliance burden is seen as too onerous. And then suddenly it tips over into more of like a communal residential, which has a whole bunch of other implications, perhaps unintended. I might jump to local government and then switch back to MSD. So for local government, the definitions, why this is important. So what is a dwelling? For some councils, they'll define that based on a kitchen. Others, it'll be a kitchen or a laundry, which surprised me, but I've encountered before with some of our councils. And so if you start to have multiple kitchens or multiple laundries in a dwelling, suddenly those are considered separate dwellings. And what that triggers is district plan provisions around the number of units or the density of units. And it will also, so if you're in a rural area, that might be a real issue because maybe you can have 1 per 10 hectares and you've got about 10 hectares. So that rules out any further dwellings. Sometimes there's an ability to consider that a minor residential unit, but that has some specific constraints and considerations around what is a minor residential unit, and its proximity sometimes to the main house is what might determine that, as well as the size of the floor plan, etc. And then also one of the other issues is around development contributions. So if it's considered a separate dwelling or they're considered separate dwellings, that triggers new requirements and new additional costs around development contributions. And then the fire risk rating, which I already talked about with our MB recommendations. And then also something that came up, which surprised me a little bit because this isn't necessarily the demographic we've been thinking about, but one of the issues that one of the councils raised is that for rural families who live on a farm, they might only be able to have the main farmhouse and kind of an accessory dwelling for a share milker or something. But when their adult children who might also be farming want to live on the property, suddenly they've got an issue because they're not able to have more dwellings on that particular farm. And it might be that, neighboring farm properties are few and far between, and it's not easy for the adult children to stay in that community and continue farming. And I thought that was quite interesting because it was something that was coming up a lot, and it wasn't something that we'd kind of considered before we did this research. And then for MSD, this one was a really big one. So basically, the way that data is collected, it means that there's this real issue around underreporting. And so whānau are deliberately underreporting the number of members of the household, and then also splitting themselves up into separate units. So a family of 9 splitting themselves into 2 separate units so that they can be eligible for housing. Because these families know that there isn't any housing for them that's large enough. And so out of necessity, they're underreporting their need and just trying to, contort their household configuration to suit what the government policy framework is so that they can get into housing. So it's a huge problem. So we want them to reconsider it, and really understand this issue and redesign their policies and processes to ensure that that's not happening. Okay, back to you.
Thanks, Jade. I've just seen some of the fantastic questions we've got popping up. So let me just kind of wrap up by talking about what could be next. I just wanted to give a shout out because we've actually had a number of architects and different developers who've reached out after, looking at the report or an article, etc. And Construct is one such team which shared this home that one of their team actually designed for their own family. It's a renovation of a state house. It took them 2 years to find the property, and it's a combination of a 2-bed unit for a grandparent and a 3-bedroom home for a family of 4 that all works beautifully together. And they had a 500K budget, which is kind of phenomenal if you look at some of the interior shots. But I just thought in terms of what could be next, really it's, an exciting space. It's about innovation. There are so many great ideas out there, and it's really about catalyzing them to be able to be delivered. So a shout out to all those who have reached out, and thank you for Construct for sharing this great project with our team. Definitely looking forward to looking at more projects in the future as well, because this is, a key area of research that our whole team is interested in. So in terms of a bit of a summary of what remains underexplored, obviously we've mentioned this idea of true demand and a lack of robust data. And, that's very much many of the reasons why we've created the New Zealand Housing Survey. But there's also a whole lot there in terms of, limited empirical evidence on long-term benefits and the social return on investment that you get when providing multi-generational housing, which I think is a really exciting space. Going forward, there's this gap around comprehensive guidelines for, culturally responsive or adaptable housing, particularly, in terms of the planning and also the financing systems being considered together alongside the design and how that actually can work, and testing that out with councils. There are some really underexplored issues around, equity, inheritance, and decision making, and like I said before, making that information accessible to support groups so that they don't have to start from scratch. So we've kind of framed that in terms of 5 key future research needs. And again, these are covered in a little bit more detail in the report, but also happy to discuss them further going forward. So if anyone would like to kind of quickly access the reports, I'll leave that there for 2 seconds while we wrap up. But I really just want to, again, thank all our participants who were involved in this research for all their insights. I want to thank the fantastic research team. It was a real pleasure to work with you all on this project, and thanks to our funders BRANZ. It was really great to also have them involved in the research as we went along. They were kind of super responsive as things evolved, so we're really appreciative of that. And also to Cha, a huge thank you to you for supporting this work and helping us to kind of share the message. So I'm really excited to switch to the Q&A because I've seen some of the great questions. So I'll pass back over to you, Paul, and you can kind of kick us off. And hopefully we can hear from Ian also.
Great, thanks Natalie, and thanks everybody for your deep engagement with this session. So I'm going to start by saying there's so many questions. I can tell that in the 11 minutes we have, we're not going to be able to get to them all. So can I make a commitment on behalf of Natalie and Jade that we'll do our best to respond to people? We've got a record of those questions, and we might take some of them offline to make sure that we get back to you, because there's a lot of important stuff in there. I'm going to go first to Ian Fistonich and just ask Ian in a second to give us an example of something that's worked really well as an intergenerational outcome, and to speak a little bit to how they structured that, because that addresses some of the questions that are in the Q&A. But first, just wanted to particularly acknowledge the importance and to thank you for the work that you've done to acknowledge the importance of research, because a lot of big research projects in the housing and social space have come to an end, the National Science Challenge, the work of Otago. So we're thrilled that there is is a levy that goes through BRANZ. We think the work that BRANZ does is enormously important, and we want to see it continue. And just recognising the good work that you've done here. So thank you very much. Ian, if I could bring you in, can you just sort of give us an overview of something from a Pacific People's housing provider perspective that you've done that's worked really well, and just speak about how you delivered a multi-generational outcome in one of your projects?
Yeah, I know we've got very limited time, but I just want to say, just acknowledge the research. What a wonderful research paper. It's a very complex area, this multi-generational housing. So, what we find really at Penina is really anecdotal evidence that once we supply larger homes, 4 or 5 bedroom homes, especially those that are aligned to multi-generational housing. So that is to say, a bedroom on the ground floor that can be used for, older people or people who are less ambulant. Those houses are just soaked up immediately. I mean, we could just do so many more. The difficulty we find is that it's already highlighted in the research. They are so much more expensive to build, so therefore the funding parameters around it kind of don't work. And I just want to pick up on one thing that the comment that was made. We really want to look at this idea of dual key units, and those dual key units, so that you can have multiple outcomes for different sort of bedroom typology requirements, but unfortunately the funding parameters at HUD kind of don't really allow that. So that's something that we would like to see is houses that can be moved around to meet the needs of whānau as time evolves. So what we've really done is just try to deliver houses with bedroom, bathroom on the ground floor, a separate living space on the second level for to allow sort of separation, some privacy between different generations, and we just find those houses are taken up immediately. I hope that answers it, Paul.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really helpful. It's a good practical example, right? And it's a scalable solution. A question from Zoe, and I'm going to direct this to you, Natalie and Jade, or you pick who wants to answer it. But was there much insight in the research that you did between, and I think it's a really interesting one, intentional living in a multi-generational environment versus unintentional? Did that play out?
I'll answer because we didn't see it in the responses, so our research didn't necessarily touch on this, but in the literature review it came up, and some of the studies we were reading from the United States were really interesting because they came into the study with the assumption that most people were living multi-generational due to financial necessity, and what they found was more often than not, although of course there will still be families in the situation where it is unintentional and it's out of financial necessity, but they found the far greater driver was usually around cultural values and being able to support one another, and that did differ across certain groups. But I thought that was an interesting finding because these were policymakers coming from the position of it's most likely out of necessity, and having that hypothesis really challenged by the research that they undertook.
Jade, that's awesome. Wayne's asked a question which is, I think, really important at the moment as we see the ever-increasing evidence of an overlap of health, mental health and housing. In particular, he's talking about mate wareware in terms of dementia and Alzheimer's, and also elder abuse as increasingly significant issues. Were there any insights around these challenges and how they've been navigated in an intergenerational context?
Not in our research, but I have an answer for that. So I will direct you to the University of Auckland, where they're leading some research around culturally fit for purpose kind of environment for whānau with dementia, but from a Māori perspective. And I just had a quick look to find out, because a friend of mine is a research assistant on it, but the lead researcher, who I haven't met before, her name's Professor Ngaire Kirst from the University of Auckland, and so they're working on designing dementia-friendly spaces with dignity, and there is a focus on kind of contextualizing some of that work for a Māori cultural context and for our Aotearoa New Zealand context. So I think they might have some interesting findings or be able to point you in the right direction. And then the second one is, in short, we didn't have great insights around how we navigate elder abuse, and what we did find in our literature review is that this is an under-researched area. So really the power dynamics in multi-generational arrangements, which I think is what gives rise to elder abuse, it's not well researched or well understood. And so it's definitely an area where further research is required. We did interview a great number of people, but even so, it's still only a relatively small cross-section. And so it didn't come up in the interviews that we did, but it was highlighted in some of our literature review research that this is an area that is really understudied.
Perfect. Natalie,
yeah,
you go.
Sorry, I was just going to add, I think what was interesting in terms of the insights that we heard was that often, people had gone into multi-generational housing for a variety of reasons. Those that we interviewed, it was often a very specific choice, not always an easy one, but also they'd found that they had to reevaluate that throughout. So we heard stories of people who'd been through, a family separation while they were living multi-generationally, which had, triggered a whole lot of legal and financial, changes that were required in terms of the model. And so I think what is interesting is that it was very much not a case of we've decided to live this way and we're sort of set, forever. It was a constant renegotiation as people aged, as additional care was required. And we also heard from a couple of people who spoke about, how valuable it was having care and support for children while they were working, etc., and how that, had sort of transformed their lives almost, but that also they were now looking at what that meant as their children aged, moved out of home in some instances. And so it definitely, as Jade mentioned, wasn't covered in tremendous depth, and there's definitely a research gap. But it was really interesting to hear about the trajectory that people took in terms of switching through different life stages of care, and how also that was related to design tweaks that people wanted to do, to their homes based on their circumstances. And so I think that there's a lot of, interesting work that could be done in that space in terms of the nuance. And we've got another couple of questions about, design and responsiveness to different issues. And I think these two things of care at different life stages goes hand in hand with an interrogation of how we could design better.
Yeah, beautiful. And just as we come to the close, I'm going to sort of combine the next two questions there into there's clearly an opportunity for more work, because there's a sort of question there looking at things through different cultural filters, but also a quite astute observation from James, where he's talking about his US experience and local context. I met a household recently who had been displaced by the large-scale demolitions in the Roskill area of Auckland, and had been told, yes, you will have the opportunity to come back to your community. So they relocated themselves and their children somewhere else in Auckland, near grandparents. And now Roskill's not being developed, and so they're not going to have the opportunity to move back. And so they've got a house somewhere else, but they didn't want to move the kids out of the school. So the kids on Monday to Friday live with the grandparents, which makes perfect sense because you don't want to disrupt. But that's a really good example of the flexibility that we've got to apply, as well as the cultural layers. So you thinking you might do some more work in the space of different cultural groups and the way this plays out?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting too, because we've also picked up on it in the New Zealand Housing Survey in terms of the difference between what people say their preference is for their next home versus what they think their most likely reality is. And there's a much stronger preference often for multi-generational housing that we're seeing, statistically speaking, now I can say, than what people think is their reality. And so, research like this that really interrogates in depth some of those quantitative findings, I think would be really meaningful. And there are some other great questions picking up on looking at design for health needs, ventilation, going into that detail. Wayne has another great point around innovative finance options, and I think a lot of these things need to be unlocked, and we've definitely tried for a careful balance between breadth and depth in this piece of work, but it is exciting to think of all the different projects that hopefully over time we will be able to kind of undertake in partnership with great groups.
as Chair, we're happy to help with some of the Q&A after the session. I think we're going to come to a close now. I just want to congratulate you on an outstanding piece of work. Obviously, when you ask really great questions and deliver really great research, it actually leads on to more questions. It's a natural process. So congratulations on a great report. We will come back to the people whose questions haven't been answered. And on behalf of Chair, thank you very, very much for the great piece of work and the hopefully stimulation and mainstreaming of multi-generational housing as a consideration that will result from it. Well done.
Awesome. Kia ora.
Kia ora.